In this video, I'm going to give you a crash course on Make and how to set up everything from the beginning, like creating an account, and an overview of the pricing, and how to connect up and automate the popular platform Airtable so that you can build out your own automations. These are all the things that I had wished I had known when I got started. It would have made my life a lot easier. Now, I'm Stephen Pope, founder of the Content Engine, and over the past 2 years, I've helped hundreds of personal brands and content agencies automate and streamline their content systems overnight. Now, creating an account is super easy. Just go to make.com and come up here to get started for free. I'm gonna walk you through a typical process. I'll let you take care of that. And now let's talk a bit about pricing. So like most tools these days, there is an annual plan and a monthly plan. Go ahead and pick monthly until you feel comfortable that you'll be using it, and then you can switch to annually. You're definitely gonna save some money. And of course, you can just start with the free plan. It's gonna give you 1,000 operations. I'll talk a bit more about what operations are, but just keep in mind, these free plans are always set up to annoy you at the most inconvenient time. There are definitely some core features that you're gonna want in the paid plans. And as well, when you're first getting started and you're testing things out, hitting 1,000 operations is pretty easy to do. So if you're serious about getting into automations, go ahead and just start with the core plan. Now, the way their pricing works is it's really sort of a matrix. They have different tiers, and then you can also select in that tier how many operations that you want. Each tier is gonna give you access to additional functionality or performance, whereas the operations are really focused on how many automations that you can run in a given month. If you're just getting started, core will work just fine. It's gonna give you access to have unlimited active scenarios, and scenarios are really just automations. So it's gonna allow you to have as many automations as you want running at any given time. It's gonna allow you to schedule automations on the minute. I'll talk more about what that is later. And it's gonna give you access to the Make API, probably something you're not gonna use right off the bat. And then as you progress into the other tiers, it's gonna give you access to additional features. Again, these are things that you probably won't be using when you're first getting started. One thing to note as you go up in the tiers is you will get priority scenario execution, which is really just saying that they're going to prioritize your automations over others. I'm not going to discuss teams and enterprise as much because they're really meant for growing teams and companies that are running a lot of automations in a given month. Now, if you scroll down, it's going to give you a more detailed understanding of all of the different features and what you have access to in quite a bit more detail. Some of these are worth looking at ahead of time just so you know what you're getting into. The free plan has a max execution time of 5 minutes. That means your automation can't run longer than 5 minutes, and it can't work with files that are larger than 5 megabytes. You can only have 2 active scenarios or automations running at the same time, and it also limits your ability to schedule automations. I'll talk more about this when we actually create an automation. Now, 5 minutes is actually pretty long for any automation to run, but one thing to keep in mind is that if you're limited to 5 megabytes when you're working with files, that's a pretty limiting factor. So when you go up to the larger plans, you're able to work with much larger files. So again, if you're just experimenting and you're unsure, go ahead and pick the free plan, and then you can always upgrade later. And if you scroll down to the bottom of their frequently asked questions, they will have a bunch of other answers to questions that you might have. Now I'm going to go over the main control panel. You can access this by clicking on your organization here. We'll dive into all of these other tabs here, but first we'll discuss everything on this page. Here it's going to show you what plan you have, the price you're paying. I'm on the yearly plan. I have 40,000 operations per month. It's going to show you your unused operations here, and again the billing interval. And at any given month, if you don't want to upgrade, you can always just buy more operations. And with this option here, it will also allow you to automatically buy new operations if you run out in the middle of the month. That way you don't have to come in here and do it manually. And this graph is pretty cool. It's just giving you an overview of how you're using the platform day to day. And it's worth noting that there's really 2 things that they track for any given plan: the number of operations that you're using, and then also how much data that you're transferring between the different automations from module to module. So typically, unless you're moving around large files, you're not going to hit any limits here. But if you are processing and moving around large files, it's easy to hit this limit. And when it comes to pricing, the data transfer limit is really controlled more by the tier instead of the number of operations. So you can find yourself in a situation where you have plenty of operations, but you've run out of data transfer. So you either need to optimize your automation or you'll need to upgrade to another tier. And then if we scroll down, it's just going to give you a list of all of your active scenarios so that you can get quick access to the automations that you have running. Now, before we get into the other tabs, here are your organization settings. You can update your name and your time zone and your country, and then a few other important details as well. Next up, if we go to Teams, this is really for the accounts that have purchased the Teams plan. In most cases, this isn't going to be necessary. Next up is the Users tab. This is where you can invite other people into your account so that they can work on your automations and work with you. Here you can manage your subscription automation. You can change the tier or buy more operations and control whether you're billed monthly or yearly. This is going to give you all of your invoices and your previous payments. Next up is installed apps. We'll cover this in future videos. Next up is variables. These are variables that you can actually use in your automations. It's going to show you things about your account, like how much data you can still transfer, how many operations are left. You're probably a bit more advanced if you're using these in your automations, but when you're debugging or managing errors or building more complex automations, these are things that you can use in those automations to make choices or to document in some sort of error log. And then next up are scenario properties. I'll cover this in more detail in another video. All right, so now let's go ahead and create a scenario or an automation. I'm going to jump over to the scenario tab and just give you a quick overview of this. Here you're able to create different folders to organize all of your different automations, and you can move your automations from one folder to another using this option here. You can also clone your scenarios or delete them. On this page, you can also turn them on or off, and then you can filter your automations by which ones are active, which ones are inactive, and which ones are just concepts. And then of course, you can also filter your automations by folder. Here I jumped to a couple of automations that I use for my content engine database program. When you're first getting started, you don't need folders. Once you have a lot of automations, if you don't use folders, it's going to get quite hard to manage them all just in this one single view here. All right, so let's go ahead and build our first automation. Go ahead and click this button here, create a new scenario. And again, a scenario really is just a automation. And here's an example of what I mean. Here's an automation that I use to help me automate content. The automation starts right here, a trigger noted by this little icon here. Some sort of event triggered this automation to start, and then it simply moves along these different lines. This is a router that splits the automation into multiple paths. And in each of these nodes, the automation is doing something. Here it's getting a record in Airtable. Here it's creating a folder in Google Drive. Here we're creating a folder in a platform called Placid. This is actually looking for errors in the automation. Here we're creating a Google Doc. Here we're updating a record in Airtable. You get the idea. So I'm back here in my empty automation. You can come up here and you can also name your automation here. And then we can get started here by adding the first module of our automation. Now this first module in your automation is important. It is the trigger. It is the source of what causes this automation to start and then ultimately go through the other modules to complete the entire task. So in this example, I am going to be using Airtable to help us demonstrate some automations. So I'm going to go ahead and pick Airtable here as our trigger. So it's at this stage here that we are going to select a way to trigger this automation to run. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to watch for new records inside of Airtable so that when we get a new record here, it will trigger the automation so then we can build out the other modules that will be run after that. So again, I'm going to go ahead and pick watch records. Now, before we move on, I'm going to talk about connections. In order to set up an automation, Make.com needs to be able to communicate with whatever platform you are trying to automate. In this case, I already have some existing connections here, but I'm going to go ahead and add a new one because if you're new to Make, you will have no connections. Now, there are typically two ways that you will add a connection. One is a little bit easier than other, and luckily Airtable is one of those. It's called OAuth authentication. So when you click add here, it's going to ask you connection type. If it gives you the option for OAuth, go ahead and use that. It's much easier. Click that. Make sure to give your connection a name. This is going to allow you to identify it later. In most cases, you're not going to need the advanced settings, so you can go ahead and click save. For OAuth connections, it's going to open up a dialog window like this where you can connect up the specific base in Airtable that you want to give Make.com access to. Go ahead and click that add base. And if I jump back to Airtable, the name of this base is Make.com example base. So I can actually just type that here, Make.com, and it pops right up, example base, grant access. Then back in Make.com, you're going to see that it now has the new connection that I created. And now we can actually connect up to the specific base. It's only going to show you the bases that you added in that authentication process where we selected the base in that dialog window. You can go ahead and click on the base that you're using. Then it's going to ask you what table do you want to trigger off of. You can go ahead and select that table. Now in this specific case with Airtable specifically, you have to have a column in that database, either a created time or a last modified time that will allow that trigger to run. It's going to use that field to know if something changed so that it knows that a new record appeared. Now by default, when you create a brand new base in Airtable, it's not going to have any one of those fields. So I'm going to come up here and I'm going to search for created and then make sure you pick created time. You can leave the field name blank. It's just going to go ahead and name it for you. I'm going to go ahead here and do create field. And so now that we have this, Make.com is able to look at that field to know if a new row was created since the last time it ran this automation to find new rows. So now if we come back here and we open this up and we do a refresh here, we can now select that created column. And then here you just need need to select what column in Airtable we want to use for the label in the automation. I'm going to go ahead and pick name. Typically, you're just going to pick the main column for the table that you're working with. Here you can select the maximum number of records to return on any given run of that automation. And then these are some more advanced options that I'm going to skip for now. And I can just go ahead and click OK. So now I'm going to jump back here to our automation, and I want to talk a little bit about the two different types of triggers, because this is an important part about Make.com and how it works. There are two types of triggers in Make.com. There are scheduled triggers that are going to run every few minutes to check the given platform that you're connected to see if something changed, to see if it should run the automation. And then there are instant triggers that will automatically run when the change happens on that platform. Instant triggers are typically a lot better because when that change happens on the platform that you're working with, say you add a new row to Airtable and you want this to trigger, if it's an instant trigger, as soon as that row is added, then it will automatically trigger this automation and then run the subsequent modules in that automation. When you see this little timer here, it means that it is not an instant trigger, and therefore it is only going to run at the schedule that you give it. So what does that mean? It means that given this schedule down here where it says every 15 minutes, Make.com is going to check and see if there are new records every 15 minutes. Now, of course, you can modify this. You can move this to a lower number. You can go down to 1 minute. And this is a good moment to remind you about this feature here, which was the minimum interval between scenario executions. This is where you're going to run up against a limit in the free plan. It will not allow you to go below 15 minutes. Whereas if you move on to one of the other tiers, you will be able to do it every minute. So if I pick 1 minute here, then that means that Make.com will go to Airtable and look for new rows every minute. And that's why we added this created date here, because Make.com needs some reference to know if a new row was created since the last time it checked. Now on the surface, this doesn't seem like a huge deal. Okay, I'll just check every minute, but every time it does this check, it's going to use one of your operations. So if you have an automation that is checking this every minute, it's going to use 3,600 operations every day just to look for new rows, which just really isn't practical. In most cases, you are going to leave it on 15 minutes simply so that you don't waste automations. But then the disadvantage is when you create a new row in your Airtable base, this automation is not going to run for 15 minutes, and that can be annoying if you want these automations to run quickly as soon as you add a new row. So in general, when you can use instant triggers, they're going to work a lot better. Now I'm going to show you an example of an instant trigger that also bypasses this annoyance that we have with the scheduled trigger. So in this case, this trigger was going to Airtable every few minutes and just checking to see, based off of this created time, if a new row was created. So I'm going to do that another way and show you the instant trigger at the same time. I'm going to go ahead and delete this module, and I'm going to add a new trigger. In this case, I'm going to type webhook, and I'm going to go ahead and select webhook here, and I'm going to go ahead and select custom webhook. Notice here you can see that it's an instant trigger. It's going to trigger immediately when that webhook receives data. I'm going to go ahead and click that, and now you're going to also see this lightning bolt here. In this case, you don't need to add a connection, but you do need to click add here, because what it's going to do is it's going to create a webhook, which is really just a URL on the Make.com platform that we can call from another remote platform. And don't worry, I'll show you how to do that and what that means and why that's important. I'm going to go ahead and click save. Notice here we get this URL here. First, I'm going to go ahead and click OK, because if I don't, that will get lost. But now what this automation is going to do is it's going to sit and listen for some other platform to call an action that is going to trigger this automation to run. And to make a little bit more sense of that, I'm going to show you in Airtable how to make that happen so that we can avoid that scheduled run that we had to do before. So in this case, I'm going to jump back to Airtable, and I'm going to jump into automation. I've already built this out a little bit. And what this automation is doing is it's waiting for a new row to be created in Airtable on that table 1. So if I jump back to the data, we see table 1, and we have the trigger type when record is created. And then we have this next step here, which is to run a script. And so if I jump into this automation here, we're going to see I have some code here. Feel free to copy that. But all this script is doing is simply calling that remote webhook on Make.com when that new row is created, so that this automation will run automatically without it being on a schedule. So again, if I come back here to the automation, you'll see that we are passing the script a variable name called record ID, and then we are passing that actual value here. And so in basic terms, when that new row is created in this row here, we want to make sure that we pass this ID to this automation so that when we call that webhook, we can pass that ID back to Make.com and then continue on with our automation. So you can see here, this script is looking for the webhook URL. Remember, we created that URL here. I'm going to click this. I'm going to go ahead and copy address to clipboard. I don't need to click OK. I've already saved it, but I'll just click OK again. Come back to Airtable. And I'm gonna drop this URL right here. And so all of this automation is gonna do is simply make a request to this URL and pass it the record ID, which is going to trigger the automation. And we're passing this record ID so that I can look it up and find that row in the table. So that I can find this row in the table, look it up, grab the data, and then continue on with our automation. Remember in the previous example, we were using a trigger on the Airtable side to look for new records. So when we continue with this automation, we will have that record. But in this example, we're using the webhook to capture that initial trigger. And so in this case, we don't have the Airtable record like we do in this example. So if we're going to solve this by using the webhook and the instant trigger, we still need to use that record ID that we are passing to make.com via this script in the Airtable automation. Then we still need to load up that row in Airtable right here. And then again, just to cover this as well, what this is doing here is that it's allowing us to take something from the previous step, which is this trigger in Airtable. Notice that the terminology is very similar in Airtable as it is in make.com. We set up a trigger so that when a new record is created, it will trigger the automation. And then in this next step, we need to pass the Airtable record ID into the script so that we can actually use it. Because if I were to write this script from scratch and not add this in here, we wouldn't have access to that record ID that we matched in this trigger here to send it to make.com to then load it up in the next module. So let's go ahead and test this out so you can see it actually happen. So I'm going to come back over to the data side. I'm going to add a new row. We'll put in a value here so that we can actually see what is loaded up here. We'll put in some notes. I won't worry about these, but if I come back to the automation, and then I'm going to go ahead and come over here and I'm going to go ahead and choose record. Now, if you were building this automation from scratch, it would be quite easy. You would simply come down here to create automation. You would add a trigger. You would say when record is created. You would pick the table that you're going to trigger off of. In this case, it's table 1. And then you would come here. You would add the script here for the next action, and then you would be able to add the variable here. You could say record ID, and then you could add the value, which is coming from step number 1 of this automation. You would put in the record ID, and then you would add the code here. So back to the example that I already have built out, I'm gonna go ahead and choose a row so that I can test this automation. I'm gonna scroll down to the bottom here. It's gonna show me the row that I just added that example text to. If I come back here, again, remember we added this example text. So in the section here, it's showing me the example. And now we can come to this next step. I'm gonna go ahead and edit the code. Remember, I copied in the webhook from make.com here. We grabbed that from the copy address to clipboard, and I pasted that here. And now we can simply just test this automation. And now if we come back to make.com and we go ahead and hit play here, I'll explain this in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But now it's waiting for that request to trigger this automation. I come back to Airtable and hit test. The script is going to run, and you can see that it added in that ID. And then if we jump back to make.com, we're going to see that it came through, and we have that record ID here now. And now what we would do with that record ID is we're going to add another module, and we are going to go to Airtable, and we are going to get a record. Again, you're going to need to add a connection if you don't already have one. I'm going to go ahead and select the one that I created in this demo earlier in the video. I'm going to go ahead and select the make.com example base. I'm going to go down here to table. I'm going to select the table. And now for the record ID, I'm going to use the value that we sent in step number 1. Here's that record ID. Now I'll go ahead and click OK. Then I'm going to go ahead and down here and manually run this one more time. Come back to Airtable, and I'll go ahead and trigger it again. Came through, and then it was able to actually look up that record. And now if we open this up, we are going to have all of the data that is in that row that we just created. So now if I wanted to test this new automation, I could come down here and click save. Make sure to click save. If you don't, you'll lose everything. Then I could go ahead and turn on the make automation. Then I could jump back over to Airtable, jump into the automation and turn that automation on as well. I'm actually gonna jump back here real quick too and exit out of the automation so that I could see the various scenarios running. Then I'll go ahead and create a new row. And then if I jump back over to make.com, we're gonna see that it automatically triggered. It didn't have to do it on a schedule. You'll see here that we have the information, we have that record ID from Airtable, and then it went ahead and got that record from Airtable and got all all of the data we needed to proceed. Now, if we hadn't used this instant trigger, then in our automation, remember we had this here, which is the scheduled trigger. Now it is a little bit simpler because we didn't have to add in this webhook, but the downside again is that it's only going to run every few minutes. So if I were to save this and then turn this on, and then I'll go ahead and back out of the automation. If I were to come back to Airtable, I'm going to turn this automation off just for this test, come back to the data here. If I were to create this row here, this automation is not going to run until that 15-minute interval is reached, which may or may not be an issue in your specific case, but if you want those to run quickly, it's not going to run. Now, if I were to reset up this automation, select the connection, select the base and the table, again, remember, select the trigger field on created, set the label field as name, and then go ahead and select OK, and then again, save it, and then create a new row. If I were to run it manually, it would find that row, and then I could continue on with my automation. In this case, since it's the first time that the automation ran, it's finding all of the new rows that were ever created in the automation. But then if I ran it again manually, it's not going to find any new rows until I came back to Airtable and added a new row, and either I ran it again manually or it came to the interval and ran on itself. But if I click here again and run, we're going to see if we open this up that we have that new row here. And so then either way, whether you used the scheduled trigger in Airtable when a new row is created, or if you used the instant trigger with the webhook and then looked up the record that was newly created, then you could continue on with your automation. For example, let's go ahead and update that same record. We'll go ahead and select Airtable. We'll go ahead and do a update of that record. We'll choose the connection that we've already created. And here's an example that sometimes you will be asked to give extended permissions. In this case, we're trying to make an update. When we made the connection previously, we only gave make.com access to read. And so now that we need to write, we need to expand the permissions. So go ahead and click continue. You can go ahead and add the same base that you are already working with. Go ahead and type make.com example base. Go ahead and grant access. Now this connection will also allow you to update a row. We'll go ahead and select the base, the make.com example base. We'll select the table, table 1. We'll go ahead and use the record ID that we passed the webhook in our trigger. So you can go ahead and select this. You can use this record ID. Then we can update the name to updated. We'll update the notes as well, updated. We can go ahead and select OK. We can save our automation. I'll go ahead and back out of the edit mode just so we can see the automations run. Then I'm going to come back to Airtable. Before I add a new row, I'm going to come back to the automations and turn this on. Remember, we turned it off for scheduled trigger example. I'll come back to the data. I'll go ahead and add a new row, jump back to make. We'll see that automation run. We triggered it. We looked that record up and then we updated it. So if I come back to Airtable, we're going to see that it updated the row based off of the second module that we updated right here. So now if you'd like to see a more advanced make.com and Airtable example that will show you how to automate your content creation, make sure to look at the video that's popping up on your screen. Click into that video. It's going to show you a much more advanced automation that you can build out and some examples around content automation. Check it out. I'll see you there.